Sengupta. This is Grin. I am absolutely delighted to have a new guest. Professor Sriya Iyer is at Cambridge. He's a Cambridge Don, as we would say. Her area of specialization is a very unique one. She specializes in researching the connections between religion and religiosity and mental health. What are the connections between these two? Some people, of course, in the past, at one point, people used to think, or more quote unquote, modern people used to think, having religious belief itself is perhaps not very mentally sane. But be that as it may, and some other people, of course, would disagree, but be that as it may, we would like to know from the professor today what her research has shown and how do these two seemingly diverse topics come together in her research. Professor Iyer, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Hindol. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to say something about these interactions between religion, religiosity, and some of the work we've been doing on these areas and their relationship to mental health. Briefly,
Let me begin by asking you that the area of mental health has become more and more important in the last few years, not least because of the COVID crisis. We heard a lot of concern about mental health and how it was impacting different people around the world when people were locked up in homes, as they say, as they saw loved ones dying around them, as they themselves were afflicted with grave diseases because of the virus. Um, After that, after the pandemic went away, concern about mental health has grown exponentially. All kinds of mental health issues are now discussed. Mental health in sport, mental health very critically in the workplace, in our educational institutions, and of course, in the family. You connect all of this to what kind of religious practices, beliefs, religiosity that people may have in their lives. Talk to us to begin with about how these two things are connected.
yes, thank you very much. So initially, when we started thinking about some of these issues, as you correctly say, when you're looking at issues like mental health, which are very serious issues now with individuals at the workplace more widely, one of the issues that I was particularly interested in, given my own background in the economics of religion, was whether in some ways religion and religiosity might help people cope better with issues around depression and mental health, and so therefore provide in some ways a form of non-clinical a non-clinical way of dealing with some of these mental health issues, in addition to the clinical methods, which of course are widely used, and whether religiosity actually exacerbates mental health issues or ameliorates them. That's really what I was initially interested in looking at. And some years ago, we did do some research, which was really looking at religion and mental health amongst adolescents in the US, and was really trying to investigate this kind of relationship. Do we think that with this group of adolescents in the US, is it the case that religiosity ameliorated some of the mental health issues that they were encountering? And what we found in that research some years ago was 2019 specifically was really that if people went, for example, to a place of worship at least once a week, there was a one standard deviation decrease in that depression symptoms. So it reduced by about 11%. So really, what we felt doing that research was that this broader relationship between religion and mental health was worth investigating. We did find some significant results, at least among adolescent populations in the US, that religiosity did significantly ameliorate depressive symptoms. And that was the research that then led us to go on from that to then look specifically at something that you were talking about, the interaction between mental health and COVID, particularly during the pandemic, whether again there was some interaction between religiosity, mental health, and what people faced during the pandemic. And that's work which we are currently doing, and which again is showing that even in that very specific period, which of course is highly unusual by most standards, that you did see that more religious people on average were able to cope better with COVID and mental health issues arising from that than those that were less religious. Again, based on a US sample.
Professor, in your opinion, why is this true? What helped a sort of reduction of anxiety, stress, depression among your chosen group that you researched, because perhaps they had access to religious practices? There's one thing to say that this happened, but why did this happen? Tell us why you think this would have happened.
So I think there's really two channels through which you can think of religiosity affecting mental health, symptoms of depression, and so forth. So one is simply that religiosity, the power of faith, on the simply or what we would call believing, would be one channel. If people were of faith, then it allowed them to cope with some of these symptoms of depression because it allowed them to appeal perhaps to other beliefs which helped them to cope with some of these depressive symptoms. But the other aspect of religion, which is really what we were focused quite a lot in some of our previous and current work, is really looking at the community aspects of religion. In that, and here, this is not so much about believing, but more about belonging. When you're actually thinking, if you are a member of a religious community, like you would be a member of any other social community, this actually provides social networks, community support. Sometimes it might provide financial help, neighborhood assistance. These things are actually quite important as well in showing that religiosity might have some kind of influence on mental health. So it was both the believing aspects, I think, and the belonging aspects that suggest that belonging to this kind of community, but in this case a religious community, had some kind of effect on people's mental health. And again, in the current research that we're doing, when we were examining the interactions between religion, mental health, and COVID, one of the things that we were also looking at there was that during the COVID pandemic, people didn't have access to physical places of worship because churches and temples and mosques were closed. And so what we also looked at, are looking at in some of the current research, is whether access to virtual services, which we did ask them about in our surveys, substituted in some ways for the lack of physical services, and whether that did have an effect as well. Because even through the virtual medium, such as this one where we're speaking today, you still can build a sense of community and both believing and belonging. So I think that's really how we think religiosity might have some effect on mental health. Of course, it should be said that when we started doing this whole research agenda, we weren't sure actually in which direction the effect was going to work, whether religiosity was actually going to have a positive effect on ameliorating mental health, or whether it was actually going to have a negative effect, in that sometimes if you feel that you are not able to adhere to the scriptures or the practices of your religion sufficiently, that too could induce, depressive symptoms. So we were not sure when we, at the outset, in which direction we thought religiosity would affect mental health. In the end, through all these various studies that we've been doing, we're actually demonstrating, a positive more than the negative effect.
To ask you, Professor, organizations or workplaces spend so much money trying to build these, this sort of bonhomie practices and team building exercises. In India, most infamously by forcing employees to go build rangoli paintings on the ground, which is the one of the most annoying things that HR in India does. But jokes apart, so much money and effort is spent by capitalistic organizations to quote unquote construct and trigger this team building or team fraternity sense within work colleagues. And yet, workplaces are consistently at the top of places which cause human beings anxiety. In research after research, workplaces come at the very top. Tell us why, in spite of all this HR effort that goes into in capitalistic organizations to create this bonhomie, actually you're saying people seem to find this community feeling more, or at least the impact is more in religious organizations. Why do you think this is true?
So that's a great question, Hindol. I think you're absolutely right that all organizations in of any kind, academic, non-academic, corporate, government, they are certainly investing a lot of resources in team building, in broader well-being initiatives, as we would call it. And I actually think this is a good thing for organizations to do, because I think in organizations you have to be concerned not just about the performance and the productivity of employees, but you also want to be concerned about their well-being and that they are enjoying their jobs and working well in teams. So I think it's a good thing actually that we are investing, in organizations in some of these aspects. But I think what our research is also showing is that the workplace is the workplace. Outside the workplace, we are, of course, influenced by parents, the broader community, children, other social networks, and that people sometimes draw upon these wider social networks to give them comfort, to give them solace, to give them a place where they don't need to think about their work. And my sense is that in some cases, religion actually provides a way of an effective way, maybe, of organizing people. It has, in general, in any part of the world. It could have legitimacy both in the eyes of the masses as well as in the eyes of the state, which means it's easy to convene, gatherings, or other kinds of occasions. So perhaps that's one reason why religious organizations in particular have a role to play in fostering well-being more widely. This is not to say that other organizations cannot foster this as well. We know, of course, people who belong to sports clubs or athletic societies or other kinds of engagement also feel that same sense of community and shared experience. But I think it's actually, as a researcher, I think it's also worth looking, very closely, specifically at religion, and what it's actually bringing to individuals. Perhaps additionally to just the fact that you can get together with others and share meals or share experiences and this kind of thing. So I think we're still far away from having a really true understanding of what might be different about the role of religious organizations in being able to foster well-being compared to other kinds of organizations, which, as you say, are also investing a lot in well-being. My own feeling is that whether they're religious organizations or other organizations, investing in well-being and community spirit and team playership and the rest of it is always going to be a good thing.
I have two questions to that, Professor. My first one is, could it be that workplace endeavors to foster this kind of well-being often fails because the source of stress and anxiety is the same? It is the workplace, or the modern culture of work is one of the most potent sites of stress and anxiety. And therefore, trying to eliminate it using the same dramatis personae, so to speak, does not perhaps often, it could yield great results, but perhaps often it does not. Could that be true? That's my first question.
So that's possible. It could also, I think that is possible, because essentially what you're suggesting is that the same individuals that might be causing the stress and anxiety can then not be used to alleviate it. It could also have something to do with the trade-offs that people have between income and leisure. So of course, one of the big debates that's going on here at the moment in the UK and in other parts of the world is whether one should actually move to a 4-day week in some ways, because this is likely to enhance productivity. And of course, with the experience of the pandemic and so forth, many of us have got used to working from home. And I think that broader debate about whether having a 4-day week would have be, good for well-being more generally, in some ways, maybe that targets the issue that you were raising, that there may be less anxiety associated with having working 4 days a week and having the fifth day working from home. Perhaps that could be one possible solution, where you are actually contributing to well-being, but then dealing with the issue that you were raising, that the source of anxiety might be other colleagues that you're working with, or indeed your reaction to them in a work in a work situation.
The thing that occurred to me immediately as an Indian, Professor Iyer, when I read your research is, um, you know, in my parents' generation, your parents' generation, and earlier, grandparents' generation, not just in India, but perhaps in every part of the world, there was some element of, what may I say, or may I call it, an inner life built in. People would go every Sunday to church. Now, perhaps they were going there and thinking about other things, the Sunday roast in England or whatever, but they were still going. There was some access. In India, people would, perhaps fast on one day. Perhaps there would be some, puja before going to work. I remember in my childhood, people rushing out of their homes, sort of, clinking the bell in the neighborhood temple, and doing a little pranam and then going onto their workplace. It would just take literally a couple of minutes, but it was some access to a sort of higher power, so to speak, or some inner life in a rushed day. All of that has been stripped away, and it has been stripped away because of two reasons. One, of course, we have increasingly been led to believe that, in a sense, and I'm going to use a simplistic term here, religion is not a very nice thing. It's divisive, it's sectarian, and so on and so forth. The other thing is that, many researchers would say technology has taken the place of religion. It is technology, as somebody's quipped, people used to turn to God for answers. Now they turn to Google. So, this primacy of technology in our life, which is only set to increase with artificial intelligence, has, in a sense, taken over our lives. I want to ask you, do you think that this complete elimination of an inner life from our societies, especially in the last 30, 40 years of late stage capitalism and globalization, has done immense harm? After all, this is perhaps the first time in human history that, from the time, human beings started making societies, that an inner life was eliminated for many people.
That's a really interesting idea. I mean, my sense is that uh, for a lot of people, I think they do have an inner life. The question is whether I think we sufficiently recognize its importance, as you were pointing out, in the daily humdrum and flow of the exhausting lives that many of us are having to lead, and whether we're making sufficient time for that inner life, which of course would contribute more broadly to our well-being. I mean, a lot of the initiatives that we were talking about a little earlier, I think, are meant for us to go back and think a little bit about whether we still have that inner life. I think the point that you're making about the role of technology is very crucial here. Again, when all of us were growing up, we didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have computers. I wrote letters to my parents once a week to communicate with them when I was far away from them. And certainly, I think perhaps going out into nature, having time to read a book, these were things that built our inner lives, and spirituality as well, for those people who are religious or spiritual or have some kind of belief. And my own feeling is that being centered in that way with that important inner life is very important, also for your outer life. And I do think, I mean, I do wonder. I haven't seen studies that have specifically looked at whether people feel that the time for their inner life has declined over time, or whether indeed Google has replaced God in where we go to for answers. But my instinct would be one of the reasons why we are finding religiosity being important for research in mental health and so forth is because when people are accessing some of these religious resources, they are essentially making time for something which is not their work life, which is actually trying to cater to their inner life. And perhaps that's why we're seeing the statistical significance of these effects in our work. I think what would be very interesting going forward with some of the research, certainly that we're doing in these areas, is really to explore this inner life dimension a little more, in terms of, is it particular aspects of calmness or that people are obtaining when they are going to a place of worship, for example, or when they're taking a walk in nature or something like this, which is actually good for their emotional development. I think, or whether it's something else. I think it would be worthwhile actually looking to some of these psychological drivers of this inner life a little more. But I completely agree with you that certainly, I think, compared to 20 years ago or 30 years ago, maybe also the need for this is greater now, as the technology and the availability of wider resources that are available to people, has also increased over time.
That gives me an excellent segue to my next question, which is that we spoke about the elimination of an inner life in my last question. But there's also a return of the inner life in different ways, enabled by technology. Mind space and mindfulness, finding mindfulness and finding the right mind space has become more important than ever before. Headspace is one of the most downloaded apps, which gives guided meditation via an app to tens of millions of people, and so on and so forth. Yoga has become really big in America. If I'm not mistaken, one of the largest communities surveyed these days say that they are SBNR, spiritual but not religious. So while they are, in a sense, keeping away from the sort of sectarian aspect of religiosity, they want to access a deeper engagement with living, should I say, which religious practice might bring. So there's been a revival, certainly, as you say, Professor, and certainly enabled with the same technologies that destroyed them in the first place. Talk to us a little bit about this revival then, because your research seems to connect exactly to this. People find it important. People find it important for their mental health, and they're accessing it in bigger numbers because they are finding that it's useful. What is really going on, according to you, about this revival of religious identity, religious practice access, and indeed, issues like mindfulness?
So, so my sense of I think what you've described is exactly right. People are accessing many more of these spiritual resources is the way I would probably call it. It could be religious, it could be spiritual, as they define it. Um, we actually have done some recent research in Brazil, which has been looking at the Pentecostal community there in particular, and actually looking at the support that religious organizations have been providing for job support. And our paper really is looking at the links between beliefs in the afterlife as well and job support, on the ground. And our paper is essentially showing that beliefs in the afterlife and belonging to certain denominations and so forth is in some ways also influencing people's job support that they're then deriving from religious organizations on the ground when faced with economic shocks of various kinds. So certainly, I think this connection between afterlife beliefs, perhaps mindfulness, if you want to take it along, that dimension as well, and actual, real world outcomes, such as the support that they're actually receiving when, for example, they lose a job and are trying to find the next one. I know some of our research is actually looking at some of these links, even now, and again finding support for some of these links. I do think that some of the research which is done in economics, which is looking at shocks to income, whether that's temporary shocks because of illness or permanent shocks, perhaps such as losing your job or losing a wage earner in the family, these kinds of things. These sorts of situations are crisis situations, and we do observe in a lot of other research on religiosity that people tend to turn to religion in those sorts of crisis situations. There is a lot of research done by other researchers, certainly, which has shown that even during the COVID pandemic, religiosity is shown to have increased. Just in response to this very strong negative shock. So my feeling is that there is greater interest in mindfulness. There is greater interest in spirituality, religion, as you look at it, and that some of this economics research is showing that it's specifically important when you have the strong negative shock. And the economic shock, because of course, one's economic well-being, physical well-being, mental well-being are all connected very closely with each other. And certainly from the perspective of the economics research, that is really where these connections are becoming more important. And of course, in the current climate, in the world in which we live, with cost of living increases, with inflation, with COVID, with supply side issues, energy crises. We've certainly had plenty of very strong shocks, which are influencing people's economic well-being in different ways. And again, I think that some of what's going on those dimensions is probably being reflected in this move towards looking more closely at meditation and mindfulness and other things. These of course are perhaps correlational. We can't say that these are causal until we've actually done the studies and shown that they may be. But certainly there is some correlational evidence that suggests that all of these things are probably pretty closely linked to each other, particularly in recent years when we've had a lot of these very strong economic shocks worldwide.
Come towards the end of our conversation, Professor, I want to ask you all the things we've been discussing in the last few minutes. It occurs to me that this is what traditionally religious organizations did. If you think about old Indian temples, they were not just sites for great spiritual activity, which they were, but they were also places where the community came together, not just for spiritual activities derived from the temple, but also mercantile activities related to those communities and that temple. And as communities came together, they also negotiated various other aspects of their lives, whether it's getting people married, whether it's birth, whether it's death, whether it's professional engagements, and so on and so forth. Indeed, many religious organizations, even today, become hubs of great, mercantile interests who find that space as in a sense, a safe space to negotiate many other aspects of their lives, which they don't want to become purely transactional. And this is not just true in India, of course. This is true, as you're pointing out, in many other parts of the world. So, therefore, let me ask you, when we think about religious practice and religious organizations, in the last 30, 40 years, especially, have we made the mistake of thinking about them in too narrow terms? After all, in England, where you're sitting, the local parish church was not just there for people to find succor via God, it was also there to host the village fete, it was also there to host the Christmas party, and so on and so forth, right? Um, that sense of community, which people bitterly miss today as we become more and more isolated, is fundamental to such organizations. And do you think we have made the mistake of not imagining these organizations to be part of a larger, wholesome community? And I've usually seen them, because of political reasons and other reasons, as very narrow sectarian bodies.
So there's a lot of research actually that's looked at how religious organizations provide what we call public goods, things like education, health, employment access, childcare, other wider support. My own research on India, for example, was really looking at public goods provision by religious organizations. In a book that I published in 2018 on the economics of religion in India, was really looking specifically at these aspects. And the argument that I was making then, which I think is probably still relevant now, is that in countries in which have the absence of the welfare state, where sometimes the provision of the public goods either is not enough or is inadequately provided, other entities might actually step in order to actually help with providing some of these goods, because populations are aspirational and everybody wants good education and good health care and employment and access to some of these wider public goods. And this is where, because of their convening power, religious organizations, particularly in India, but also in other countries, have actually stepped in to provide a lot of these services. In some ways, complementing the services that are also provided by secular entities. So I do think that when we're thinking about religion today, the big question really is, with increasing economic growth worldwide, why is it that religion is actually becoming quite salient in certain parts of the world? And my sense is that because I think some of these organizations are not really just confined only to the religious aspect. Of course, the faith-based aspect, the spiritual aspect is very much at the heart of many of these organizations, but that they've also widened their range of activities, in some ways may also be providing very helpful social security and helpful a wider access to resources that perhaps people can otherwise not get access to. My view actually is that by providing some of these public goods, it also mitigates the potential for future conflict, because if conflicts normally arise over public goods, whether it's land or education or health or employment, if a wide variety of organizations are actually providing some of these services, that might then mitigate the potential for conflict in the future. So I think, but at the same time, one also has to be careful, because while the spiritual motive is very important and the public goods motive is very important, it also has to be used very positively for economic development. And I think there's a lot of heterogeneity, I think, in terms of the kinds of religious organizations, the services they're providing, where the activities are. And certainly, as you point out, this mercantile role it has been there historically with temples in India. It's also been there historically with churches in the UK. And one of the reasons why sometimes you see the decline of religion in Northwestern Europe, for example, is also coincident with the formation of the welfare state, which provided all of the public goods. And religion is very salient in Latin America, Africa, South Asia, the other parts of the world, where sometimes the public goods is, still need to be much better provided in certain segments. So my feeling is that you can think of religious organizations in a positive way. No one is denying that there are also negative aspects, which other scholars have written about, but you can also see them in a positive way if they are providing some of these services that are supporting local communities. Certainly, we know that worldwide during the pandemic, churches and temples and mosques and others have really been helping with the food distribution aspect, particularly with soaring inflation and high cost of living.
Yeah,
We
like in
definitely
Akshay
know that
Patra,
all of
for
these.
instance, in India.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Akshay Patra in India is a fantastic example. Certainly, many of these organizations have been providing support and help, particularly with respect to providing food when we've had this very big worldwide shock. So my sense is, where I think we're going with some of these ideas is that. There is potential for religious organizations, I think, to play a very positive role, and some certainly do. And perhaps one needs to explore more that link between economics, religion, food distribution, well-being, more holistically, to come up with interesting solutions, for example, for issues around economic development.
Let's conclude then, Professor Iyer, on the note we began. Fundamentally, all of these things that we just spoke about, whether it's economic activity, familial activity, work-life balance issues, they all, of course, are connected also to the primary idea of mental health, because they all have an impact on our mental health. And from your research, from what I understand from our conversation, also shows that an access to some sort of spiritual activity, in a sense, could mitigate some of the more harmful aspects of mental health crises that we see all around us. Isn't that Wouldn't that be correct?
I think what I would say is that I think the primary way of dealing with mental health issues still is, of course, the clinical way. It has to be the clinical way. We're not
Yes.
impinging on that research, which I think is very clear and very strong. What we are saying is that to complement the clinical way of actually dealing with mental health issues, perhaps we should also be looking at some of these non-clinical options to complement, in addition, not as a substitute, but as a complement. And that perhaps in looking at those non-clinical options, we may want to engage more with the issue of religion and religiosity in dealing with some of these mental health issues. That's really what our research is suggesting.
So thanks very much for joining me from Cambridge today. It's been fascinating listening to all the wonderful research that you have done and indeed are doing, and throwing new light on understanding the role of spirituality and religion in our lives. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much, Hindol.